Okay, now we discuss the issue of a low threshold of relevancy. You remember in the definition of this relevancy, we actually have these words, that is any tendency. Once again, in the discussion of this low threshold of relevancy, you should pay attention to this highlighted part, that is any tendency. Okay, so what do we mean by this low threshold of relevancy? That simply means if the evidence has any tendency to prove or disprove the existence of a fact, and then that evidence would satisfy this low threshold of relevancy. We need to understand, if we say any tendency, that simply means no matter how low, how slight it is. So we understand this because this threshold is set so low, it is not difficult. It is not difficult at all to satisfy this, to meet this low threshold of relevancy. We can discuss some examples, and that would demonstrate this. What we mean by this low threshold of relevancy. So first, let's look at this Nancy's example. Nancy is charged with embezzlement. The prosecution intends to offer evidence to show Nancy is in possession of a new BMW. But Nancy contested this. Nancy actually says this evidence is irrelevant because she argued this car is a gift from her uncle. Nancy argues, I did not commit this embezzlement. I did not really buy this car with embezzled money. This car actually is a gift from my uncle. All right. So now the issue is whether the prosecution's evidence. The prosecution, Nancy is charged with embezzlement. The prosecution intends to offer evidence to show after this embezzlement, after Nancy embezzled the money, she actually bought this expensive car, whether this prosecution's evidence is admissible or not. That is one example. One case scenario. Another case scenario would be this Adam's case scenario. Adam is charged with burglary. The prosecution intends to offer evidence to show after the police talked to him about this burglary, Adam just fled to Florida. But Adam argues he did not, he says, he did not commit this burglary, and he did not flee to Florida. He went to Florida to visit his sister. So the question here is also, should this evidence be considered relevant evidence or not? The answer to the question is, in both cases, this prosecution's evidence should be considered relevant. Why? Because of this issue of a low threshold of relevancy. Okay, we understand this. Nancy actually, in Nancy's case, Nancy argues she did not commit this embezzlement, and then he did not really use the embezzled money to buy this expensive car, and this car is actually a gift from her uncle. But that is Nancy's explanation. In the consideration whether this evidence should be considered relevant or not, we need to ask this question. Even though Nancy has a different explanation regarding this BMW, whether there is a possibility, however slight that possibility may be, whether we have this possibility, it is possible Nancy actually purchased this BMW with embezzled money. We know we cannot say there is no such possibility at all. Even though Nancy has a different explanation, there is a such possibility she actually used embezzled money to buy this expensive car. So if you put this in the context of this requirement of a low threshold of relevancy, and then we have to say this evidence is relevant because this threshold is low. We are saying so long as this evidence has any tendency to prove the existence of a fact that would satisfy this relevancy requirement. So we know we cannot really say it's totally impossible that Nancy used this embezzled money to buy this car. So if we cannot say it is totally impossible, and then we have to say there is a slight, no matter how slight it is, there is a slight possibility that he may use embezzled money to buy this car, and then this evidence should be considered relevant. The same analysis goes to Adam's case. Even though Adam says he went to Florida to visit his sister, but we know we cannot really say there is a 100% no possibility and he actually went to Florida because of this investigation of this burglary. We cannot really say that. So if we cannot say it is a totally impossible that Adam went to Florida because of this investigation into this crime, and then we also have to say this prosecution's evidence actually satisfies this low threshold of relevancy, so the prosecution's evidence should be considered relevant, should be admitted. We know Nancy and Adam have their own explanations as to this expensive car and also this trip to Florida, but that is really the issue for the jury to decide. And then the prosecution's evidence would be admitted, and then at trial, Nancy and Adam, they can explain to the jury. They can offer the jury their own explanation about this car, about this trip to Florida. Of course, the prosecution would also offer their theory as to this in regard to this expensive car and also this trip to Florida. And then it is up to the jury to decide which version of the story, which side of the story they should believe in. They should give credit to. So that is how we decide whether this particular item of evidence is relevant or not. Just remember, we have this very low threshold of relevancy, so it is not difficult at all to meet this low threshold of relevancy. Let's look at another example. And in this example, the defendant is on trial for robbery, for robbing a jewelry shop. So the prosecution intends to offer the evidence to show when the defendant was arrested, he was wearing an expensive ring. But it is important for you to take note of this another condition in this story, that is, the jewelry shop owner determines that the ring was not stolen from the shop. So we know the defendant is on trial for robbery of a jewelry store, and then the prosecution wants to offer evidence to show when the defendant was arrested, he was wearing this very expensive ring, but the jewelry store owner already said this ring was not one of the rings stolen from the store. So the defendant would argue this fact that he was arrested with a very expensive ring on his finger, this evidence is not relevant. So how should we determine this issue? Should we consider this ring on the defendant's finger relevant evidence or not? So the answer to the question is, most likely the court is going to rule this ring is admissible. It is relevant because it satisfies the low threshold of relevancy. What is the argument? The argument will be because the defendant is wearing this expensive ring, that means he loves jewelry. So if a person loves jewelry, that would make it more likely, and he would go there to rob a jewelry store, to rob these rings and from the store. So because, once again, because we have this low threshold of relevancy, even though this ring is determined not one of the rings stolen from the store, but as we said, the argument can be made because the defendant was wearing this ring. That means the defendant likes these expensive rings. So that make it more likely, more probable, he probably committed this crime of robbery of this jewelry shop. So that is how we should understand this low threshold of relevancy. Another issue we want to discuss is this relevancy versus credibility. Relevancy is an issue of law. This issue will be determined by the judge. By the judge, of course, according to evidence law. In the class, we are going to learn a lot of evidence rules. So whether a particular item of evidence is relevant or not, that is the issue determined by the judge. The judge will determine that issue according to evidence rules. All right? So it is important for you to remember when the judge is making this determination, whether this evidence is relevant or not, the principle is if this evidence is believed, if believed. All right? The issue is like this. If suppose we have this, the defendant is on trial for shoplifting, and then the defendant's girlfriend would come to court to testify. And, before trial, there would be this pre-trial hearing, and then the judge will make a determination at this pre-trial hearing whether certain items of evidence are relevant or not. So the judge would examine this defendant's girlfriend. So in his examination, the judge believed this girl is really telling a lie because the story is not consistent, and judging by her demeanor and behavior, the judge just believes this girl is not telling the truth. All right? So the issue is, how should the judge rule on the issue? Whether the judge would say this girlfriend's testimony is relevant or not. And then this is where this if believed, this principle would come in. Even though the judge would believe the girl's story is not credible, but he should rule this girl's testimony is relevant because it is relevant if it is believed. The girl would provide this alibi testimony for the defendant. So if this alibi story is believed, that would be relevant, right? So the judge should rule the evidence is relevant. And then this evidence, once admitted, will go to the jury. And then at the trial, the jury will determine the issue of credibility. All right? If the evidence is ruled relevant, the item of evidence will be admitted, but not necessarily the jury will believe in this evidence. The jury may determine whether the evidence is credible or not. So the issue of this credibility, that is determined by the jury. So the principle for the judge to determine whether an item of evidence is relevant or not, the principle is if believed.